And then the last wave would be what we're having now, right? Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump. So kemunduran demokrasi karena pemimpin eksekutifnya, presidennya atau perdana menterinya secara sengaja mengambil kebijakan yang membuat kualitas pemilu lalu kemudian kebebasan politiknya itu mundur. Oke. Di titik itu kita semua bisa refleksi apakah di Indonesia juga sedang mengalaminya, ya kan?
Selamat bergabung di Podcast Hubungan Internasional. Podcast ini dikelola oleh Departemen Ilmu Hubungan Internasional Universitas Gadjah Mada.
Hai friends, selamat datang lagi di Podcast Hubungan Internasional. Hari ini saya, Ayu, udah ditemani oleh Pak Ben. Halo Pak Ben.
Selamat pagi Mbak Ayu.
Sip. Untuk mengisi podcast kali ini, nama saya Ayu, saya pengajar di Departemen Hubungan Internasional. Saat ini saya sedang sekolah di University of Florida, dan riset saya tentang masyarakat sipil dan kemunduran demokrasi di Asia Tenggara. Pak Ben di sini juga punya riset tentang demokrasi. Boleh berkenalan sedikit Pak Ben?
Ya, saya Ben Smith, saya dosen bidang ilmu politik di Universitas Florida. Saya kerja dengan Pak Ayu di situ. Riset saya sekarang fokuskan pada reformasi struktural ekonomi Indonesia di tahun 80-an. Setelah itu transisi demokrasi tahun 90-an dan koneksi di antaranya.
Nice. So, Ben, we're talking about autocratization.
Yes.
Beberapa orang bilang kalau riset kita soal demokrasi kan, tapi beberapa orang bilang kalau otokratisasi itu adalah kebalikannya, so it's the reverse of democratization. But let's start from the basic. Like, what is it? What is autocratization? And can we really call it as the reverse of democratization?
Yeah. Saya menjawab pertanyaan kedua pertama. Itu prosesnya tidak kebalikan. We think about autocratization, sebetulnya itu proses rezim menjadi rezim otoriter. Tetapi proses demokratisasi tidak kebalikan otorisasi. They're two different processes, and they're not identical, but in reverse. And that leads us to another thing that we should be careful of, which is to think about otorisasi, kemunduran demokrasi, democratic backsliding, dan liberalization. There are three different dynamics, the three different concepts, and itu saling penting untuk kami berpikir tentangnya kalau berbeda.
Oke. Sebagai konteks buat teman-teman yang nonton podcast ini, akhir-akhir ini kita suka gelisah kan gitu. Ada yang bilang Indonesia tuh demokratis, tapi kok kualitasnya semakin jelek gitu kan. Dan ternyata ini dihadapi di banyak negara ya, Ben ya. Beberapa orang bilang, oh demokrasi kita lagi mundur gitu. Terus beberapa orang bilang, oh kita sedang mengalami otokratisasi. Kita sedang berubah menjadi negara yang tidak seliberal dulu gitu, illiberalization. And you think that these three concepts are different.
Yes.
And that proses menjadi negara otoriter itu tidak bisa dipahami sebagai kebalikannya proses menjadi demokrasi, gitu kan?
Yeah, benar.
That's what you're saying.
Benar.
Okay.
Yeah. So, misalnya the guided democracy period from 1957 onward, that was like a process of democratic weakening, right? And illiberalization, or the decline of liberalism. But that's different than a decline in electoral democracy, right? Biasanya waktu kita riset demokrasi secara statistik, kami pakai konsep demokrasi yang minimal, electoral democracy saja, right? Karakteristik liberal, biasanya di luar. Because we need a minimal concept that allows us to think about and then to analyze democratization dan kemunduran demokrasi across many, many countries. And it's very, the more detail, the more attributes, liberalism, civil liberties, press freedom, the more attributes that we add, the more complicated it becomes for us to think and to research across a couple of hundred countries and to understand the process of democratization or democratic backsliding. And so usually today, when we think about democratic backsliding, we're really talking about the erosion of civil liberties or a democracy becoming less liberal. Not necessarily less electorally democratic, but less liberal. And those are two very different things. And it's really important to think about them that way.
But how do you, okay, I agree with you, kalau kemunduran demokrasi itu ditandai dengan masyarakat yang semakin tidak bebas. Ya, tidak bebas bicara, tidak bebas berkumpul, tidak bebas berpendapat gitu. Dan kadang-kadang ini terjadi tanpa harus ada kemunduran pemilu. Yang juga itu juga elemen penting dalam demokrasi. But in many cases, it happens in parallel.
Yes.
Di saat yang sama kita nggak bisa berpendapat, di saat yang sama juga pemilunya pemilunya juga kualitasnya kurang baik gitu. Ada banyak politik uang. Orang ngerasa ngapain aku milih gitu. So how do you make sense of it? What would you call a process where there is liberalization but at the same time also a decrease in electoral quality?
Yes. That is democratic backsliding.
Okay.
There's a wonderful article by Andreas Schedler in the Journal of Democracy called Menu of Manipulation. And he thinks about electoral democracy as a 7-stage process. And interrupting or disrupting any of those 7 stages is effectively damaging electoral democracy. That's really important to think about. He doesn't talk about political liberalism at all. He talks about the quality and freedom of elections. Who's able to vote? Is everyone of a certain age able to vote? Are certain people banned from voting? Our colleagues at the University of Florida, Mike McDonald and Dan Smith, they talk a lot about the quality of electoral democracy in the United States, right? And they're very focused on the quality of elections. Who gets to vote? How are the votes counted? Are all parties equally able to engage the electorate and to campaign for office? Are some parties banned from using public television, right? Do some get banned from access to newspapers? These are really important elements of free electoral democracy. And so even though we think about it as minimal, it's really crucial. And that's the absolutely crucial part of democracy without which we can't make liberal democracy.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, Ben. I think I agree with that point. Aku setuju kalau kita ngomongin demokrasi, aspek elektoralnya, aspek pemilunya itu penting banget dan memang harus selalu bisa dievaluasi dia berjalan dengan baik apa enggak ya. But then you also mentioned that there is other elements in a democratic society gitu kan. Kita harus punya pemilu, tapi juga ada aspek liberalismenya nih, political liberalism. I know this is a very common terms in political science. Cuman kalau di percakapan sehari-hari di bahasa Indonesia gitu kan, liberalisme, liberal can mean a lot of things.
Yes.
Can we spend a couple of minutes to clarify what do you mean by political liberalism?
Sure.
In a democracy.
See, I'm gonna fall back on John Stuart Mill.
Right.
Yeah. Kalau saya, John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. It's very short. It's a quick read. Tells us almost everything we need to know about how to treat other people and how to live in a democratic society. What I mean by that is his focus on individual liberty. It doesn't mean that we can't be individuals who who identify ourselves very, very closely as part of a religious community or an ethnic community. But it means that at the core of the way we organize politics is about protecting individual freedoms. You and I must have the same rights to go out and demonstrate in the streets, no matter what opinions we are vocalizing, unless those call for violence against other people, right? To the extent we are not harming our fellow citizens, we have to have the freedom to engage in politics. We have to have the freedom to imagine what the good life means. That's really what Mill was up to, is thinking about maximizing the ability of every individual to live his or her best life. Absent harm to others. And that means that we have freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of all of these everyday things that make our lives more or less constrained. And we want a polity that constrains us minimally. And the job of government should be to protect us from violations of our liberties, not to regulate our liberties. That's the ideal liberal polity. And you think about all these adjectives, it's not so hard to imagine why so few countries in the world come very close to it.
Yeah. So we have like the electoral part of democracy and the liberal part of democracy. Dan banyak negara pengen mencapai dua-duanya, right? Yeah. Electorally good and sound and fair. Yeah. And liberally dan mereka bisa menjamin freedom. Yeah. Right, tapi kemudian tentu saja tidak semua negara bisa mencapai ini. And you can evaluate a democratic country based on these two measures. Actually separate, like you can measure them, evaluate them like separately, right? The electoral and liberal part. So going back to our topic about kemunduran demokrasi, you are saying that if we are experiencing kemunduran demokrasi, it could be just the liberal aspect, or the electoral aspect, or both. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
The two are distinct, but they sometimes, as you pointed out, they sometimes decline or improve in parallel right, at the same time.
Okay.
One of the reasons that we're at a point as scholars, but also out there in the world, is we're in a new phase of imagining how governments become authoritarian. So this is that Barbara Getty's article that we've talked about. And as she points out, the first major process of Otokratisasi was in the decolonization period, where there were so many brand new post-colonial democracies like Indonesia's from 1949 to 1957. In a lot of the global south, in the post-colonial world, those regimes were overthrown by armies, right? Or in military coups. So that's process one, right? Otokratisasi itu selama coup militer. The second process she lays out took place during the third wave, where the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of so many of those military dictatorships in Latin America, in Africa, and even in Southern Europe, took place in the 1970s and 1980s. The third stage, the third major model of autocratic becoming, if you want to call it that, is the one that's led us to so much confusion about terms. Yeah. Because as she points out, and I think she's completely right, today most of the erosion of democracy, most backsliding, most autocratization, most illiberalization takes place at the hands of incumbents who were democratically elected and then undermine democracy. Ferdinand Marcos might be the concept model for autocratization with his autogolpe in 1972, right? Taking a democratically elected presidency and making it into a dictatorship, right? Viktor Orban in Hungary, Donald Trump in the United States. We have examples all over the world. Ortega in Nicaragua. So we have a lot of examples of that. And the fact that we have so many governments that are becoming either less liberal or less electorally democratic today at the hands of elected incumbents. That's why we're now starting to think about these concepts, and it's why we sometimes get confused about them.
Yeah, okay. But first, let me clarify this before I, recap, like making a recap of it, what you just said. So you're saying that ketika kita sekarang lagi ngerasa demokrasi nggak baik-baik saja, it's actually not the first time the world experienced it, right?
No.
We've been there
Yeah.
before.
Fenomenanya sama.
Fenomenanya sama, kemunduran demokrasi,
Yeah.
tapi penyebab modelnya beda,
Prosesnya.
prosesnya beda.
Yeah.
Dan tadi Ben berusaha bilang kalau di wave pertama, stage 1 or gelombang pertama dulu pas zaman-zaman 1940-an, setelah banyak negara merdeka gitu, biasanya prosesnya karena kudeta gitu ya.
Yeah.
Mana ya contohnya Ben?
Ghana, the 1960s, overthrew its elected government. Nigeria, 1966, overthrew its elected government. Indonesia, 1965, 1960, overthrew its elected government.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, the examples are everywhere. Chile, 1973,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Brazil, 1964.
Yeah.
There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds,
Yeah.
of examples. Thailand every 2 years.
Yeah, true. So kudeta oleh tentara gitu.
Yeah.
Lalu kemudian 30 tahun kemudian 1970-an ada gelombang kedua, right? Otokratisasi juga gitu.
Yeah.
Dan tadi disebabkan oleh mostly gelombang kedua itu what was it? Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So one of the main periods that Geddes talks about in the second stage is the emergence of autocracies in Belarus,
Okay.
in Uzbekistan, in
Gotcha. Okay.
as a function of the Soviet collapse.
Right. Yeah.
So the emergence of lots of newly independent countries,
Right.
fragmentation of the former Yugoslavia led
Right.
mostly to new autocracies.
Ya, so bukan karena orang military yang membajak demokrasi,
Yeah.
tapi ada proses perubahan struktural besar-besaran, Uni Soviet collapse,
Yeah.
ada banyak instability gitu,
Yeah.
and that paved the way for the next.
That's exactly right.
autocratic
And
leader.
the thing that's really important to understand is that most of the elites who built those new autocracies were old elites, right? Just like in Indonesia, the democratic transition in 1999 recycled old elites, right? Elite recycling is a really important thing to think about because the replacement of autocracy with autocracy, or even in a case like Indonesia, the replacement of Orde Baru dengan demokrasi, the collection of elites largely remained the same. They just became part of a new democratic polity, and they continued business as usual.
And apparently they're not as reformed as we should think about them.
Yeah.
Reformasinya setengah-setengah. Okay, and then the last wave would be what we're having now, right? Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump. So kemunduran demokrasi karena pemimpin eksekutifnya, presidennya atau perdana menterinya secara sengaja mengambil kebijakan yang membuat tadi kualitas pemilu, lalu kemudian kebebasan politiknya itu mundur, gitu ya. Oke. Di titik itu kita semua bisa refleksi apakah di Indonesia juga sedang mengalaminya, ya kan? Balik ke gelombang ketiga tadi, Ben, because it's closer to us, right?
Yeah.
Otokratisasi karena pemimpin eksekutifnya dengan sengaja mengambil kebijakan yang membuat kualitas demokrasi mundur. Gitu. Salah satu mungkin kegelisahan atau salah satu pengamatan yang banyak orang bisa lihat adalah banyak banget pemimpin-pemimpin ini, like all these executive leaders, were actually elected democratically, right? Yes. So how do we make sense of this sequence? Like when does democratic backsliding start? Like apakah kita sudah bisa bilang kemunduran demokrasi dimulai ketika pemimpin-pemimpin ini terpilih, atau itu ketika pemimpin ini terpilih dengan cara demokratis, like democracy is still okay, but then apparently they're illiberal, and that's when democratic backsliding starts. So how do we make sense of this sequencing?
Well, at the macro level, right?
Okay.
I think it's important for us to think about democratic backsliding as the erosion atau kemunduran demokrasi electoral, right? The decline in the quality of elections, in the freedom of elections, in equal access of all parties campaigning to have equal ability to run for office and to field candidates. The less fair elections are, the more we can think about democratic backsliding. I'd like us to think about the erosion of civil liberties and liberalism as a different process, right? Which is the slow and steady seizure of the rights that we all take for granted in a liberal polity as a different thing. But almost as important, if not maybe more important, is for us to think about why ordinary people vote for illiberal leaders. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're voting for autocrats.
Okay.
It means that there are other things they associate with illiberal leaders that they value more, maybe, than their own civil liberties. So, in the first panel yesterday morning, Ehito talked about what he called authoritarian nostalgia, and that concept means we're sort of imagining that people think, I'm going to vote today because I really liked how autocratic the new order was. I really liked how repressive it was. I don't think that's what most people are thinking, but they're associating that period. Orde baru tidak harus dalam pikirannya otoriter, tapi kesejahteraan, keadilan, right? They think about order and prosperity, right? My economic life was better. It was easier for me to provide for my family, right? There was less crime in the streets, things like this. And they're not necessarily right about those memories, but it doesn't matter, right? Because people vote the way that they imagine some past, if they're voting on the basis of their ideas about the past. And even if they're wrong, those are still meaningful things for them to think about. And so it's our job to think about understanding them where they are, which is to say, understanding that ordinary voters, even very poor voters, can be very savvy and they can prioritize things differently than we do as liberal academics.
So the consequence of that process would be a democratic process can actually produce illiberal leaders.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
And then once they get elected, it is these illiberal leaders that start, steadily adopt policies that would, erode democratic quality. That's
if you think about the evolution of the way Americans thought about Donald Trump from 2016 to 2020, it's a really nice illustration of this. Most people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 didn't really, I don't think, pay a lot of attention to his illiberal ideas. But as he began to try to implement those during his presidential term, people began to pay attention as it began to affect them or their children who were in college or their children who were running for office or any number of things. And their minds really changed, right? And they voted him out 4 years later. And in the United States, it's very uncommon for presidents not to win a second term. But he was bad enough and people were concerned enough that they limited him to one term. And I hope we'll continue to limit him to one term.
Right. I want to go back to your observations about, how illiberalism or, illiberalism, we could say that, affect people differently. How democratic, eroded democratic quality, may affect people differently. Karena kan kadang-kadang gini loh, saya sebagai peneliti demokrasi, I would say to a lot of people that, hey, Indonesian democracy is backsliding. And then, pasti ada orang yang bilang bahwa enggak kok, gitu. Enggak kok, baik-baik aja, gitu. So, as if people would have different ideas about democracy, right? So, pertanyaanku adalah, kalau orang punya different ideas, demokrasi itu apa? Buat aku, demokrasi itu soal kebebasan akademik. Buat orang lain, seperti kamu bilang tadi, buat banyak orang Indonesia, demokrasi itu harusnya bisa menghadirkan kesejahteraan ekonomi. Terus buat banyak yang lain gitu. So the imaginaries are different. Then how can we judge there is a democratic backsliding? You see, if the democracy itself are experienced and imagined differently, then how can we say, as scholars or students of democracy, how can we say that, okay, starting from this point, we can say that this country is backsliding democratically?
For me, it's really important to try and translate the often really complicated language we use as academics into ordinary. Yeah. Menerjemahkan dalam apa?
Bahasa sehari-hari.
Yeah, bahasa sehari-hari. So, for example, if I tell somebody on the street in Gainesville, Florida, where you and I live and work, the quality of electoral democracy is declining, most people won't know what I mean. But if I say the Republican governor of Florida just signed a law restricting voting hours, and that means that if you are a low-income worker and you have to work 8 to 5 every day, and the polls are only open from 8 to 5, you don't get to vote unless you take time off and sacrifice income. That's more meaningful, right? I want to vote, but I'm being prevented from voting practically because the governor intentionally limited voting hours to during my workday, and now I don't have time to vote. That's effectively taking away the vote from someone based on their income, right? As a professor, I have a very flexible schedule. I can vote whenever, so it doesn't matter to me. But for most people, it will matter. And that kind of sort of street level explanation, I find to be more convincing to people who don't necessarily think about, electoral democracy as something they should worry about themselves.
But then we have these different, as you say, we have different experience of democracy or autocracy.
Yeah.
So conceptually speaking, if we want to, study it, how can we tell if the democratic backsliding starts? If people's conceptions of democracy are different.
Well, I'm going to go back to Adam Jaworski.
Yeah.
In 2000, he published a book with 3 of his former graduate students called Development and Democracy. And they decided on a very minimal definition of democracy. And they were very honest about it. They said, this is how we define it. We know it's minimal. We know it doesn't include liberal attributes. We're okay with that. We want to be maximally transparent. You can disagree with us, but at least you know how we're defining it. So when we say this is a dictatorship and this is a democracy, you know why we're saying it. So for example, their data ends in the year 1990. They classified Japan under the Liberal Democratic Party as a dictatorship. Why? Because the LDP had not yet lost an election and had to turn over power. 2 years later, they did, right? And that for them was conceptual confirmation that Japan was democratic. But they did the same with Botswana under the Botswana Democratic Party, because as of 1990, the BDP had never lost an election, and they still haven't. But we think about electoral democracy in Botswana as free and fair, but for the sake of caution, they code all countries without a turnover as dictatorships, because we don't know.
You told me earlier that Adam, it's so hard to mention his name. Jaworski.
Yeah.
Terlalu
banyak konsonan.
Iya, terlalu banyak konsonan. Nama Indonesia banyak vokalnya, jadi nggak susah itu. Dia bikin artikel tentang the concept of democracy when we, and how it connects with the way we think about autocracy. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. For the purposes of quantitative research on lots and lots of countries and lots of regimes, it's important for us to think about a concept and then a variable to capture that concept that's as clean, as simple as possible, right? But its simplicity means that it's normatively unsatisfying, right? Because it doesn't include the liberal attributes that we think are so important. That's what he means. And he means it's okay for us to separate them. And so that's really where we run into trouble, is when we start confusing the decline of electoral democracy quality with the decline of liberalism.
Okay.
Both are, I think, normatively both are bad, but they're differently bad.
Right. And when we are trying to evaluate democracy, we have to be clear. What are we explaining here?
Yeah. So the point is not to be unconcerned, but to be careful about why we're concerned and about what we're concerned.
Okay. I guess there are several important takes from this short conversation, right?
Yeah.
First, ketika kita bilang kemunduran demokrasi, ada kemunduran kualitas pemilu, ada kemunduran dalam hal kebebasan politik, right? Dan ketika kita berusaha mempelajari proses kemunduran demokrasi, kita harus bisa jelas gitu. Yang mana sih yang lagi kita ukur, yang mana yang lagi kita pelajari gitu. Karena dua-duanya bisa terjadi secara terpisah, bisa terjadi secara bersamaan, dan dan mungkin loh di suatu negara secara kebebasan politik mundur, tapi elektoral masih oke, pemilu masih oke, sehingga proses-proses pemilu itu menghasilkan terpilihnya pemimpin-pemimpin yang kurang peduli dengan kebebasan politik gitu ya.
Tidak liberal.
Yes. Dan pertanyaan yang harus selalu kita tanyakan adalah kenapa kok orang masih mau memilih pemimpin yang illiberal? And that's really the task of us as students of political science. Gitu.
Penulisan komentar Anda itu sempurna. It's exactly right.
So, terima kasih Ben sudah hadir di podcast kali ini. Semoga ada kesempatan lain kali. Terima kasih sudah mendengarkan semua. Hi friends, sampai jumpa di podcast berikutnya.